Peace to you all in the heart of Jesus. Welcome. The title of my talk today is The Way of Darkness and the Cloud of Unknowing. This is in the series of talks entitled The Recovery of the Spiritual Tradition of Prayer. From its very beginnings, the theology of the spiritual life has rested on two fundamental principles of faith, spelt out by the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 6. Anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who search for him. Simple as it may seem, behind this statement lies the whole sweep of the teaching of the mystics on the life of prayer. The paradox is that God is God and has become man for man's sake. To approach God is to approach the Supreme Being, infinitely transcendent and holy, and yet infinitely near because of the Incarnation. The immanence of God and his transcendence must always find a place and will always cause a certain degree of tension in Christian spirituality. The early Christians had experienced Jesus in their lives and believed absolutely, as St. Irenaeus says, that God became man so that man may become God. But how? And that still remained the question. How was man able to reach communion with the utterly transcendent yet immanent God? If we read the Fathers of the Desert, we will not find a treatise on prayer. The Fathers knew that they could give the disciple a word by which they could be saved, a word that would prepare the ground for prayer. They could tell a disciple how to fast, how to make vigils, to do penance, to cry out for tears, and how to say the Jesus prayer. But ultimately they knew that prayer was God's gift, and only he could give an experience of himself. In time, therefore, two schools of thought on prayer developed, and these have become two different approaches to the mystical life. First, there was the via negativa, the way of darkness. This stresses that because God is the ever greater God, so radically different from any creature that he created, God is best known by negation, forgetting, not knowing, without images or symbols. And in darkness, God is not this or not that, not anything that the human mind can construct. All images, thoughts, symbols, and so on must be eliminated in coming to God. The second school of thought, the via positiva, the way of light. This way underscores finding God in all things, especially through our thought, the mind. It emphasizes a definite similarity between God and creatures, that God can be reached by creatures, images and symbols, because he has shown himself in creation and in history. Each of these two schools tended to become identified with two theological schools of thought of the 3rd century at Alexandria and Antioch. The Alexandrian school developed largely round the teaching of Clement of Alexandria, of Origen and Evagrius of Pontus. The emphasis in this school was on the intellectual grasp of God. God is experienced as light in an intellectual vision. So their mysticism was one of light. On the other hand, the Antioch school, the school of darkness, was more Semitic in influence and accentuated the total existential encounter with God in the heart. This spirituality, developed chiefly by Ignatius of Antioch, the great St. Anthony of the Desert, Gregory of Nyssa, stressed the total unknowability of God. Man is in the darkness and can only experience God only in the darkness. It is in the heart, not the mind, that God is encountered. So man must purify himself, for he cannot grasp God in any other way. One of the great masters of this way of darkness was a man who goes by the name Pseudo-Dionysius. We don't know much about him, but he lived at the latter part of the 5th or early 6th century, and he wrote a treatise entitled Mystical Theology. This man was very influential in this school of the way of darkness. For him, God was in the darkness, and he could only be reached through darkness. He could not be known except by what he is not. The way to God is the way of unknowing, of negation. As Dionysius says, "Into this dark, beyond all light, we pray to come, and unseeing and unknowing, to see and to know him that is beyond all seeing and beyond all knowing, precisely by not seeing and by not knowing. For that is truly to see and to know, and to him transcendently, him that transcends all." And again, later on, Dionysius says, "Ascending higher, we say he is not soul or intelligence, not imagination, or conjecture or reason or understanding, no, not word or intellection, not word, not number, not order, not magnitude, not littleness, not living, not life, not essence. Beyond. This great teacher, Pseudo-Dionysius, had a great influence on the development of spirituality after this time, especially so in the Western prayer tradition. We can see his influence on many spiritual writers in later times, in especially the Dominican writers Eckhart, Tauler, and the Flemish mystics, but most particularly and most well known, but one whose writings need great care to read and study, St. John of the Cross. But in this country, there was a great writer in the 14th century. We don't know his name, he's anonymous, that influenced this school of spirituality, of prayer, the way of not knowing, the way of darkness. And the famous book, spiritual work, which you can get in many different editions today, is called The Cloud of Unknowing. It's a masterpiece, a spiritual masterpiece, and it belongs clearly to this school of Dionysius, the school at Antioch, and it was written in a period. It was written about in the 14th century, at a time in Europe where Europe was in the throes of the 100 Years' War. The Black Death was decimating every country it entered. Social unrest was showing itself in the English Peasants' Revolt. Medieval Christendom was passing away and modern nationalism was coming to birth. At the same time, this is an age when, in spite of all the troubles, Europe was deeply religious. Faith penetrated the hearts of the people and influenced their art, music, and literature, and every part of their lives. Chaucer may well have laughed humorously at the foibles of monks and nuns, but he accepted the established religion with an unquestioning mind. And both Chaucer and his public took their faith for granted. From the beginning, the Cloud of Unknowing makes it clear that the work of contemplation is only is only for those who wish to become perfect followers of Christ. He says he is writing for the skilled contemplative, whose prayer is intuitive, spontaneous, and prayed at the sovereign point of the Spirit. The merely curious, the gossipers, the flatterers, or the self-deceived need not even attempt to read this book. Indeed, they must be prevented. So he says in his introduction. What is the doctrine of the Cloud of Unknowing? Firstly, God, in his love, is calling his young disciple to a higher degree in the spiritual life, and though he does not deserve such a privilege, he must respond to it with the utmost diligence and humility. Second, the disciple's attitude must be one of longing desire for God and love for Him. It will involve a spiritual watchfulness, a forgetting of the past, a dedicated will, and a determination to reach out to God through love. Thirdly, contemplation is God's work. Our task is to respond with our will. We are to put aside the lower activities of the soul, to check the imagination, silence the discursive reason, reduce the intellectual act to the very simple contemplation of God's being. Fourthly, the disciple is brought face to face with a dark cloud of unknowing between himself and God. This darkness is the absence of knowledge. Fifthly, the soul is counselled to remain, to stay in this darkness as long as possible, evermore crying to Him whom you love, says the author. He must do nothing except cultivate a naked intent, stretching to God. This naked intent is also described as, by the author, a sharp dart of longing love. As the author says in chapter 12 of his work, let your longing relentlessly beat upon the cloud of unknowing that lies between you and your God. Pierce that cloud with the sharp dart of longing love. Spurn the thought of anything less than God, and do not give up this work for anything, for the contemplative work of love is by itself will eventually heal you of all the roots of sin. Sixthly, once love has sprung, the soul can press longingly upon God. Love is the key to contemplation. God is not known through thought, but through love. As the author says, by love may he be gotten and holdened, by thought never. So there is no discursive reasoning, no thinking. Even thoughts about God are a distraction to the soul. Seventhly, after a while, all this is left behind, and the contemplative must cast down everything beneath the cloud of forgetting. Just as the cloud of unknowing separates man from God, so this cloud of forgetting must separate us from this work from all created things. And finally, the eighth point of the doctrine of the cloud. So in beating on this cloud of unknowing, the contemplative attains a comprehension of God which is beyond all the powers of the intellect, and is a foretaste of the joys of heaven. How does one know if one is called to contemplation? First thing, make sure you do everything to purify your conscience. Or shall we put it in a more traditional way, to be always in a state of grace. And how can we be in a state of grace? We must regularly examine our conscience before God in prayer, and we must avail ourselves to the sacrament of penance regularly. Is God, through his divine inspiration, drawing you to have some persistent attraction to this simple form of prayer? Do you have a real desire for this prayer, even when it seems the feeling is absent? These are the questions. And if the answer is yes, then we will move on to the conditions of contemplation. I will spell them out by quoting from the author each time. Number one, as the author says, he who desires to become perfect in this work must forget everything except God. 2, he must struggle hard enough, although God may sometimes intervene. Thirdly, man must not begin his contemplative work until purified in penance. 4th point, when distracting thoughts arise, 2 things can be done. I mentioned this in an earlier talk about wandering and distracting thoughts, by the way. 2 things. Look beyond them, or say it's futile to contend with them, and just cast yourself upon God's mercy. 5th point, methods of prayer in themselves cannot bring you to contemplation. It's a gift of God. In fact, we must be on our guard against trying and struggling and forcing ourselves. It must be natural. It must be spontaneous. It must be a gift. It must of God, and in a disposition and in a drawing of you to this way. And there are 3 basic things, however, to feed or to fuel contemplation: study, a reflection, and prayer. And finally, the author says that contemplation seems to transfigure a person, even physically. Well, my dear friends, that concludes my talk today on the Way of Darkness, in particular as shown in the mystical work of the 14th century English work called The Cloud of Unknowing. We will touch upon this school of prayer later when I want to talk to you particularly about St. John of the Cross, the famous Spanish mystic, who was a great friend, of course, of St. Teresa of Avila, another great Carmelite mystic. So, I hope you found this interesting. enlightening, food for the soul, and may God bless you all, keep us all safe in the heart of Jesus, and may God keep you and bless you always. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. And finally, please tell others about my YouTube channel, because I wish to reach out as an apostolate of my priestly ministry to help people to pray better, to grow in holiness. Bless you.